She called the cops because my garage had too many motorcycles. Not loud ones, not stolen ones, just too many. According to her, the sight of them was keeping her awake at night. I wish I were joking. That's how it started, with one nosy HOA president and 23 parked Harleys. No one warned me that collecting old bikes on my own land would trigger a neighborhood meltdown. But it didn't stop at phone calls. It turned into reports, cameras, city inspectors, and eventually something no one in our quiet little suburb will ever forget. If you think HOAs are just about lawn height and mailbox color, think again. This story gets wild. Drop a comment if your HOA's ever gone off the rails, or if you've been accused of disturbing the peace by doing absolutely nothing. My name is Daniel Evans, and I never thought owning 23 classic Harley-Davidsons on my own property would drive a 38-year-old woman to call the police 17 times in 2 months. But that's exactly what Clara Whitney did. My ranch sits on 12 acres of Arizona desert, about 20 minutes outside Scottsdale. I bought this place 8 years ago specifically because it was in the middle of nowhere, with a garage big enough for my collection. These weren't just any motorcycles. These were vintage Harleys from the 1960s through the 1980s. Each one was a piece of American history that I'd restored myself in my spare time. I'm a former Marine who served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home and opening my own motorcycle repair shop. The ranch was my sanctuary, my place to work on bikes and find peace after everything I'd seen overseas. The garage could fit 30 bikes easily, and I had exactly 23 beauties lined up like soldiers at attention. Every morning, I'd walk through and check on them like they were my children. Some people collect stamps or coins. I collected freedom on 2 wheels. The closest neighbor was half a mile away, and there wasn't a homeowners association in sight when I bought the place. That was exactly how I wanted it. Then Clara Whitney moved into the new Desert Ridge development 5 months ago. The HOA had built their little suburban paradise right next to my property line, complete with matching beige houses and rules about everything from mailbox colors to grass height. Clara bought the house closest to my ranch, probably because it was the cheapest one in the development. From her bedroom window, she had a perfect view of my garage and the occasional glimpse of chrome and steel when I had the doors open. Most people would have thought it was pretty cool to live next to someone with such an impressive collection. Clara was not most people. She showed up at my front door 3 days after moving in, wearing a bright yellow pantsuit that looked like she was dressed for a business meeting at a furniture store. Her makeup was so thick I wondered if she was afraid her face might crack if she smiled. "Hi there, neighbor," she said with the fakest sweet voice I'd ever heard. "I'm Clara Whitney, your new HOA president. I wanted to discuss your motorcycle situation." I invited her in for coffee, thinking this would be a friendly chat about being good neighbors. How wrong I was. Clara looked around my living room like she was conducting an investigation, taking mental notes of everything from my military photos to my leather furniture. "So those motorcycles in your garage," she said, not even bothering with small talk. "They're quite numerous, aren't they?" I explained that I had 23 vintage Harleys that I'd been collecting and restoring for over a decade. "Well," she said, setting down her untouched coffee, "I think it would be best for everyone if you could relocate them somewhere more appropriate, perhaps a storage facility or a commercial garage." I stared at her like she'd just suggested I donate my kidneys to charity. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice calm the way the Marines taught me, "this ranch has been here for over 15 years. Your HOA was built around existing properties. I have every right to keep my motorcycles on my own land." Clara's fake smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in her eyes. "Mr. Evans," she said, standing up and smoothing her pantsuit, "I think you'll find that being a good neighbor means making compromises. I do hope you'll reconsider your position." As she walked to the door, she turned back with that plastic smile. "Because I'd hate for this to become an unpleasant situation for all of us." I thought Clara was just another difficult neighbor who'd eventually get used to living next to a motorcycle enthusiast. That was my first big mistake. Clara Whitney wasn't just difficult, she was a woman with a plan and a very personal reason to hate everything about motorcycles. As I watched her yellow pantsuit disappear down my driveway, I had no idea that she'd already started building a case against me before we'd even met. The war had begun, and I didn't even know I was fighting yet. Clara's first call to 911 came exactly 1 week after our coffee meeting. I was in my garage working on a 1974 Sportster when I heard sirens coming up my driveway. Officer Grayson Ford stepped out of his patrol car looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Grayson and I went way back. We'd served together in Afghanistan and had been through hell and back as Marines. Seeing him at my door in uniform was like watching your best friend show up to arrest you for breathing too loud. "Hey, Dan," Grayson said, taking off his hat and running his hand through his graying hair. "I hate to do this, but I got a call about some kind of illegal motorcycle operation going on out here." I laughed because I thought he was joking, but the look on his face told me this was dead serious. "Someone reported suspicious motorcycle activity and demanded a welfare check," he continued. "They said there were too many bikes and it looked like some kind of criminal enterprise." I led him to the garage and opened the doors wide, revealing 23 perfectly restored Harleys sitting quietly in their spots like museum pieces. Grayson walked through the garage shaking his head. These weren't stolen bikes or some kind of chop shop operation. They were works of art. Every serial number was legitimate, every registration was current, and every bike was in better condition than when it rolled off the assembly line decades ago. "Dan, this is ridiculous," Grayson said, pulling out his notepad with obvious reluctance. "But I have to file a report because she specifically demanded documentation of the visit." He started taking photos and writing down details about motorcycles that were completely legal and properly stored on private property. "She?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Clara Whitney from the HOA, Grayson confirmed. "She called this morning and said she was concerned about potential illegal activity involving motorcycles. When dispatch told her we couldn't investigate without probable cause, she claimed she was worried about community safety." As Grayson wrote his report, he told me this wasn't Clara's first call. She'd been phoning the department regularly, asking about noise ordinances, property violations, and anything else she could think of related to motorcycles. The absurdity of the situation hit me when Grayson had to officially document that my garage contained 23 vintage motorcycles in excellent condition, properly stored on private property with no violations observed. He looked at me with the same expression he'd worn in Afghanistan when we had to follow orders that made no sense. "Dan, legally I can't tell you this, but she's called 6 times in 2 weeks, each time with different complaints about noise, visual disturbance, or suspicious activity." I realized Clara wasn't going to give up. She was building something bigger. After Grayson left, I noticed Clara's silver sedan parked at the end of my driveway. She was sitting behind the wheel with what looked like a camera taking pictures of my property. When she saw me looking, she drove away quickly, but not before I got a good look at the thick folder on her passenger seat. This woman was documenting everything, building some kind of case against me like I was a criminal. The next morning, I found her parked in the same spot at exactly 7 a.m., camera ready, waiting for me to open my garage doors. This became Clara's daily routine. Every morning at 7, every evening when I came home from work, and randomly throughout the day, I'd spot that silver sedan lurking near my property line. She was taking photos, timing my activities, and writing down license plate numbers of anyone who visited my ranch. My friends started commenting on the weird lady with the camera who seemed to be stalking my property. I tried to ignore it, thinking she'd eventually get bored and find something else to obsess over. But Clara Whitney was just getting started. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the city attorney's office. Someone had filed multiple complaints about noise violations, property misuse, and potential zoning infractions at my address. The letter demanded that I appear before a city hearing to address these serious concerns about public safety and community welfare. As I read through the legal language, one thing became crystal clear. Clara wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was someone with enough knowledge of the system to weaponize it against me. Grayson warned me that evening when he stopped by off duty. "Dan, she's building something big. I can't tell you what to do, but you need to be careful." I still thought this was just harassment from an entitled HOA president who wasn't used to being told no. I had no idea that Clara's war against my motorcycles was about to escalate to a level that would shock everyone in our small community. The certified letter from the city was just the beginning of Clara's campaign to destroy my peace of mind. Within 2 weeks, she had convinced 3 of her neighbors to sign formal complaints about my disruptive motorcycle activities. These people had never even seen my bikes running, but Clara had somehow persuaded them that 23 parked motorcycles constituted a public menace. The complaints all used identical language about decreased property value and safety concerns for children, like they'd been written by the same person with a thesaurus and a grudge. Clara's psychological warfare started small but escalated quickly. She began parking her car directly across from my ranch entrance, not on my property where I could have her trespassed, but right at the legal boundary where she could watch everything I did. She'd sit there for hours with her camera and notebook, documenting when I opened my garage, who visited my property, and even when I checked my mailbox. My girlfriend Tessa noticed it first when she came over for dinner. "Daniel, that woman has been staring at your house for 20 minutes, she said, peeking through the curtains. "That's not normal neighbor behavior." The anonymous flyers started appearing around the neighborhood a week later. Someone was leaving papers on doorsteps warning about motorcycle gang activity and dangerous criminal elements in the area. The flyers didn't mention my name specifically, but they included a map with my ranch clearly marked as a location of concern. When my neighbor Mike brought one over, he was laughing about how ridiculous it was. "Dan, some crazy person thinks you're running a biker gang," he said. "I told my wife you're the most boring, dangerous criminal I've ever met," but other neighbors weren't as understanding. That's when I learned about Clara's past from Tessa, who worked part-time at a legal office and knew how to research public records. Clara's ex-husband had been a member of the Desert Wolves Motorcycle Club, a legitimate riding group known for charity work and community service. But their marriage had ended in spectacular fashion when Clara discovered her husband cheating with another club member's wife at a bike rally. The divorce had been public, messy, and humiliating for Clara. She'd lost her social status, her financial security, and apparently her mental stability. Every time she looked at my motorcycles, she was seeing her ex-husband's betrayal all over again. Understanding Clara's motivation didn't make her behavior any less crazy, but it explained why she seemed personally offended by the existence of my bikes. This wasn't about noise or property values. This was about a woman transferring her trauma and rage onto an innocent neighbor who happened to collect the same machines that reminded her of her worst life experiences. But knowing why she was doing it didn't make it any easier to deal with the constant surveillance and harassment. I started checking my security cameras obsessively, jumping every time I heard a car door slam, and losing sleep over what new complaint Clara might file next. The business sabotage began in month 3 of Clara's campaign. My motorcycle repair shop started getting strange phone calls from customers canceling appointments. When I asked why, they mentioned receiving safety warnings about my business practices. Someone had been calling my clients and telling them I was under investigation for criminal activities and association with dangerous people. 3 major restoration projects were canceled in 1 week, costing me over $3,000 in lost revenue. I knew exactly who was behind it, but proving it was another matter entirely. Clara's attacks became more personal when she started targeting my relationship with Tessa. She would call Tessa's workplace, claiming to be concerned about her boyfriend's criminal associations and suggesting that Tessa might want to distance herself from potential legal troubles. These calls were always anonymous, but Clara's voice was distinctive enough that Tessa recognized it immediately. "She's trying to isolate you," Tessa warned me. "She wants you to feel like you're fighting this alone." The stress was affecting both of us, and I could see the worry in Tessa's eyes every time Clara's silver sedan appeared at the end of our driveway. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I discovered that Clara had reported my garage to the city building inspector. She'd claimed I was operating an illegal commercial business out of a residential property and demanded a full inspection of my facilities. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Bob who clearly had better things to do, spent 3 hours going through my garage with a clipboard. He found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong to find. My motorcycles were properly stored, my electrical was up to code, and I wasn't running any kind of business out of my garage. But the inspection cost me a day of work and added another official document to what was becoming a very thick file. That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by 23 silent motorcycles and felt truly angry for the first time since this whole ordeal began. These bikes had been my therapy, my escape from the memories of war and the stress of everyday life. Now Clara had turned them into weapons against me, making me feel guilty for owning something that brought me peace. I punched the workbench hard enough to bloody my knuckles, and the sharp pain brought a moment of clarity. I was done playing defense against someone who was clearly unstable and determined to destroy my life. It was time to fight back, but I needed to be smarter about it than Clara was. Clara made her biggest mistake on a Wednesday morning when she decided to go after my livelihood directly. I was working on a customer's bike when my phone rang with the worst news I'd gotten since this whole mess started. Mrs. Henderson, who owned a 1967 Electra Glide that I'd been restoring for 6 months, was canceling her contract and demanding her bike back immediately. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking with nervousness, "but someone called and told me you were under criminal investigation. I can't risk being associated with that kind of trouble. That phone call cost me $3,000 and 6 months of work." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one. Within 2 hours, I received 3 more cancellation calls from long-term customers who had suddenly become concerned about my legal troubles and criminal associations. Each caller mentioned receiving anonymous warnings about the dangers of doing business with me. The stories were all variations of the same theme. I was supposedly under investigation by multiple agencies, my property was linked to illegal activities, and anyone associated with me might face legal consequences. It was obvious that Clara had spent considerable time researching my customer list and systematically destroying my business relationships. The nuclear option came that afternoon when a city inspector showed up at my shop with a clipboard and a very serious expression. Someone had filed a complaint claiming I was operating without proper business licenses and engaging in fraudulent commercial activities. The inspector, a stern woman named Patricia, went through my paperwork with the thoroughness of an IRS auditor. She checked my business license, my insurance, my tax records, and every permit I'd ever filed. After 4 hours of investigation, she found absolutely nothing wrong because I'd been running a legitimate business for 8 years with perfect compliance. "Mr. Evans," Patricia said as she finished her inspection, "I want you to know that this complaint was completely without merit. Your business is properly licensed and operated. However, I am required to document every complaint we receive, regardless of how frivolous it might be." She handed me a copy of the original complaint, and I wasn't surprised to see Clara Whitney's name at the bottom. But seeing it in official print, seeing how far she was willing to go to destroy my life, triggered something inside me that I hadn't felt since Afghanistan. I drove home that evening with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear but from barely controlled rage. When I got to my ranch, Clara's silver sedan was parked in its usual spot at the end of my driveway. She was taking photos again, documenting my arrival like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. For the first time in months, I walked directly toward her car instead of ignoring her. She rolled up her window and started the engine, but I knocked on the glass before she could drive away. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice level despite the fire burning in my chest. Clara rolled down her window about 2 inches, just enough to speak through. "I don't have anything to say to you," she replied with that same fake, sweet voice she'd used during our first meeting. "Ma'am," I said, leaning down to look her in the eye, "you've cost me $3,000 in business today alone. You filed false reports with multiple city departments. You've harassed my customers and my girlfriend. This needs to stop right now." Clara's face transformed from fake sweetness to cold satisfaction. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, "but perhaps if you'd been more cooperative from the beginning, you wouldn't be having these problems." That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by my motorcycles and felt completely defeated for the first time since coming home from war. Clara had systematically attacked every aspect of my life, my property, my business, my relationships, and my peace of mind. She was winning because she understood the system better than I did, and she was willing to lie and manipulate in ways that had never occurred to me. I punched the concrete wall hard enough to split my knuckles open, and the physical pain was almost a relief from the emotional frustration that had been building for months. But that night, I made my first real mistake. Still shaking with rage, I got on my '72 shovelhead and rode. No helmet, no lights, just the desert wind and a mind full of fire. About 3 miles down the highway, red and blue lights flashed behind me. I pulled over and faced another patrol car, but this time it wasn't Grayson. A young officer stepped out and kept his hand near his holster. "Sir, we've received a tip about a reckless rider matching your description," he said. I apologized, explained I was blowing off steam, and after checking my license, he let me go with a warning. I didn't think much of it until the next morning. Clara had security camera footage of me leaving my driveway like a bat out of hell. She posted a 10-second heavily edited clip to the Desert Ridge Facebook group with the caption, "Unstable neighbor linked to biker activity, caught fleeing police in middle of night." Within hours, the post had over 100 comments. Parents were suddenly asking if their kids were safe. A board member texted Tessa asking if she was okay at home. It was digital gasoline poured over Clara's fire, and this time I'd given her the match. When I showed the post to Tessa, she just stared at the screen. "Daniel, this changes things," she whispered. "People believe her now. You need to stop giving her ammo." I nodded. I'd finally understood. This wasn't just war, it was optics, and I was losing. Tessa found me there an hour later, sitting on the floor with bloody knuckles and 23 silent motorcycles for company. "Daniel," she said, kneeling down beside me, "this has to stop. She's destroying you piece by piece, and you're letting her do it." I looked up at her and saw the worry in her eyes, the strain that Clara's harassment was putting on our relationship. "I don't know what else to do," I admitted. "She's got the system figured out and I'm just reacting to whatever crazy thing she does next." Tessa took my injured hand in hers and said something that changed everything. "Then stop reacting and start acting. Fight back, but fight smart." That conversation was the turning point that shifted me from victim to strategist. I realized I'd been playing Clara's game by her rules, always on the defensive and always surprised by her next move. But I was a former Marine who'd survived 2 combat tours by learning to think tactically and anticipate the enemy's moves. It was time to apply those skills to civilian warfare. The next morning I made a phone call that would change everything. "Tommy," I said when my old friend answered, "I need to call in that favor you owe me." Tommy McKenzie and I had been friends since high school, but our bond was forged in the desert of Afghanistan where we'd served together as Marines. He was now the president of the Desert Wolves Motorcycle Club, a group of 47 veterans and working-class guys who rode together and supported each other through thick and thin. When I told Tommy about Clara's systematic harassment campaign, his response was immediate and predictable. "Brother," he said in his gravelly voice, "nobody messes with family. What do you need us to do?" The Desert Wolves weren't the kind of motorcycle club that Clara's paranoid imagination had conjured up. These were guys who worked construction, served as firefighters, taught school, and ran small businesses throughout Arizona. They organized charity rides for veterans, volunteered at homeless shelters, and helped each other through divorces, job losses, and family crises. But they also understood the value of solidarity and the power of showing up when one of their own was being threatened. Tommy's plan was simple and perfectly legal: a community support ride to show Clara exactly what real motorcycle activity looked like. "Here's what we're going to do," Tommy explained during our planning meeting at his construction office. "Saturday afternoon, every Desert Wolf who can make it will ride out to your place for a barbecue and bike show. Then we'll take a little cruise through the neighborhood to see the sights, maybe stop by that HOA office building to admire the architecture." I could see the wheels turning in Tommy's head as he worked out the details. Everything completely legal, completely peaceful, and completely overwhelming for someone who thinks 23 parked bikes are a problem. Clara's response to this plan, which she somehow learned about through the neighborhood gossip network, was predictably extreme. She hired a private security guard to watch my property 24 hours a day, claiming she feared for her safety due to escalating criminal activity in the area. The guard, a bored-looking retired cop named Frank, parked his pickup truck at the edge of my driveway and spent his days reading newspapers and drinking coffee. When I walked over to introduce myself, Frank seemed embarrassed about the whole situation. "Nothing personal, buddy," he said. "Ladies paying me $200 a day to sit here and watch for trouble. Easiest money I've ever made." The security guard was just the beginning of Clara's escalation. She installed 3 additional security cameras around her property, all pointed directly at my ranch in clear violation of privacy laws. She called an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss immediate security threats and demanded that the city provide extra police patrols in the area. She even contacted the local news station with a story about motorcycle gang intimidation in a quiet residential neighborhood. Fortunately, the reporter who took her call had enough sense to check the facts before running with Clara's fantasy. Tessa spent Friday evening helping me research our legal rights for the planned ride. As someone who'd worked in legal offices, she knew how to navigate the system and ensure we stayed within the bounds of the law. "You have every right to peaceful assembly," she confirmed after reviewing the relevant statutes. "As long as you're not blocking traffic, making excessive noise, or trespassing on private property, there's nothing Clara or anyone else can do to stop you." She also discovered something interesting in Clara's HOA filing documents. The private security she'd hired was being paid for with HOA funds, which was potentially illegal use of community money for personal purposes. Friday night, 47 Harley-Davidsons rumbled into my driveway like rolling thunder. The sound was incredible, a symphony of American engineering that echoed across the desert and announced to everyone within 5 miles that something significant was happening. My neighbors came out of their houses to watch the spectacle, some with curiosity, others with obvious approval. Even Frank the security guard rolled down his window to get a better look at the impressive display of vintage motorcycles and their equally impressive owners. The Desert Wolves were exactly what you'd expect from a group of military veterans and blue-collar workers, disciplined, respectful, and absolutely united in their purpose. They set up their bikes in perfect formation across my property, each one positioned with military precision. These weren't thugs or criminals. They were men who'd served their country and built honest lives in their communities. Many of them brought their wives and children to what was officially just a weekend barbecue and bike show. The contrast between Clara's paranoid fantasies and the reality of 47 family men enjoying hamburgers and talking about motorcycles couldn't have been more stark. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Tommy stood up to address the group. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "we're here because one of our own is being harassed by someone who doesn't understand what we're about. Tomorrow, we're going to show this neighborhood what real community support looks like. We're going to ride together, stay together, and demonstrate that desert wolves protect family." The responding cheer from 47 voices was so loud that Clara's security cameras probably picked it up from half a mile away. That night, as I watched 47 motorcycles parked across my property like a mechanized cavalry unit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence. Clara had been winning this war through manipulation, lies, and abuse of the legal system. But tomorrow, she was going to face the reality of what happens when you push too far against people who know how to push back. The desert wolves weren't going to break any laws or make any threats. They were simply going to exist in overwhelming numbers until Clara understood that she'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. Saturday afternoon at exactly 2 p.m., 47 Harley-Davidsons fired up their engines in perfect synchronization. The sound was like nothing I'd ever experienced, a rolling thunder that shook windows and announced our presence to every living thing within 10 miles. We pulled out of my driveway in tight formation, 2 columns of chrome and steel moving with military precision through the quiet suburban streets of Desert Ridge. Neighbors came out of their houses to watch us pass, some waving, others taking photos, all of them witnessing something they'd probably never see again in their peaceful little community. The ride to Clara's HOA headquarters took exactly 12 minutes, and we maintained perfect discipline the entire way. No speeding, no unnecessary noise, no aggressive behavior of any kind. We were 47 American citizens exercising our constitutional right to peaceful assembly, and we made sure every aspect of our demonstration was absolutely legal and beyond reproach. Tommy had briefed everyone extensively. We were there to show support for a brother, not to intimidate anyone or cause trouble. The desert wolves understood the difference between strength and aggression, and today was about displaying the former while avoiding any hint of the latter. The Desert Ridge HOA headquarters was a small, beige building that looked more like a real estate office than the seat of neighborhood government. It sat on a corner lot with a tiny parking area and a pathetic strip of decorative grass that someone probably watered twice a week, whether it needed it or not. The building was designed to blend in with the surrounding suburban landscape, which made our arrival all the more dramatic. 47 Harleys pulling up to a building meant for maybe 12 cars created an instant visual that transformed the entire block. We parked in perfect formation along the public street, each bike positioned with the precision of a military honor guard. The desert wolves dismounted and stood beside their machines in complete silence, 47 men in leather and denim creating an imposing but peaceful presence that filled the entire area around the HOA building. Some wore their military service patches, others displayed the charity ride pins they'd earned over years of community service. These weren't the dangerous criminals from Clara's imagination. They were veterans, fathers, and working men who'd simply come to support a friend. Clara's response was immediate and predictable. Within minutes of our arrival, she was on the phone calling every authority figure she could think of. Through the large windows of the HOA office, we could see her pacing frantically while barking into her cell phone. She called the police, the sheriff's department, the mayor's office, and probably the National Guard if she could have found their number. Her voice was high and shrill, carrying through the glass as she described a terrorist siege and gang intimidation tactics to anyone who would listen. New expanded content, 150 words. In her desperation, Clara made another critical mistake. She called the local news station, Channel 12, demanding they send a reporter to cover what she described as an armed siege by a motorcycle gang. When reporter Sarah Martinez arrived 20 minutes later with her cameraman, she expected to find chaos and intimidation. Instead, she discovered 47 polite men standing quietly beside beautiful motorcycles, some of them reading newspapers while others chatted with curious neighbors who'd brought them bottles of water. "Ma'am," Sarah said to Clara, who was still screaming into her phone, "I'm not seeing any criminal activity here. These gentlemen seem very peaceful." Clara's face turned red as she realized her call for media support had backfired spectacularly. "They're terrorists," she shrieked, pointing at Tommy, who was helping a little girl take a selfie with his vintage Harley. The contrast between Clara's hysteria and the calm reality was so stark that Sarah decided not to run the story at all. That's when things got really interesting for Clara. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly resident who lived 3 houses down from the HOA office, walked slowly across the street with her walker. She'd been watching the situation develop from her front porch, and she had something to say. "Clara Whitney," she called out in a voice that carried decades of authority, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen anything as disgraceful as your behavior today." The old woman looked around at the assembled bikers and shook her head. "These men are more respectful than you've been in months." Major news in the world, and the constant contact. Officer Grayson Ford was the first to respond, pulling up in his patrol car with the weary expression of someone who'd been dealing with Clara's calls for months. He walked over to Tommy and me, shaking his head with obvious frustration. "Gentlemen," he said formally, "I've received multiple reports of a disturbance at this location. I'm required to investigate and ensure no laws are being violated." Tommy stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Officer, we're conducting a peaceful assembly on public property. Every vehicle is legally parked, every man here is a law-abiding citizen, and we're not disrupting anything except this lady's peace of mind." Grayson walked through our formation, checking for violations and finding none. We weren't blocking traffic, we weren't on private property, we weren't making excessive noise, and we weren't threatening anyone. 47 men standing quietly beside their motorcycles on a public street was completely legal, no matter how much Clara didn't like it. "I have to ask," Grayson said quietly, "how long are you planning to stay here?" Tommy smiled and gestured toward the HOA building. "Until that lady understands that harassment has consequences. Could be 5 minutes, could be 5 hours. Depends on how quick she learns." The psychological impact of our presence was exactly what we'd hoped for. Clara was trapped in her office, surrounded by 47 men who represented everything she'd been trying to destroy about my life. Every time she looked out the window, she saw proof that her campaign against me had failed spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, she'd united an entire community of riders in my defense. Instead of making me look dangerous, she'd made herself look crazy. The contrast between her hysterical phone calls and our calm, silent presence spoke volumes about who the real problem was in this situation. Tommy's masterstroke came after we'd been there for an hour. He walked calmly to the front door of the HOA building and left a small package on the doorstep. Inside was a motorcycle helmet identical to the one Clara's ex-husband used to wear, along with a simple note, "Real bikers don't abandon family, desert wolves." When Clara saw the package through her window, she let out a scream that we could hear through the glass. The helmet was a direct connection to her trauma, a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she was trying to destroy. It was psychological warfare at its finest, perfectly legal but devastatingly effective. As the afternoon wore on, something beautiful began to happen. The residents of Desert Ridge started coming out to see what was going on, and instead of fear or concern, they showed curiosity and support. Children asked their parents about the motorcycles, teenagers took selfies with the bikes, and several neighbors brought us bottles of water and asked questions about our rides. The community was seeing exactly what Clara had been fighting against, a group of ordinary men who happened to love motorcycles and look out for each other. The contrast between Clara's paranoid fantasies and the reality of 47 polite, well-behaved bikers couldn't have been more obvious. By 4 p.m., Clara had completely lost control of the situation and herself. She was screaming at police officers, demanding they arrest us for crimes we hadn't committed, and making increasingly wild accusations about terrorism and gang activity. Meanwhile, 47 desert wolves stood in perfect silence, proving through their behavior that everything Clara had said about us was a lie. We didn't need to say a word or make a single threat. Our presence was our message, and that message was crystal clear. Mess with one of us, and you mess with all of us. While Clara screamed at police officers through her office window about dangerous bikers and terrorist activity, something much more important was happening inside the HOA building. Tessa had scheduled an appointment weeks earlier to review the HOA's financial policies as a concerned resident, and Clara had been too distracted by our presence to remember or care about the meeting. This turned out to be the biggest mistake of Clara's entire campaign against me, because what Tessa found in those financial records would finally give us the ammunition we needed to end this war permanently. Tessa discovered that Clara had been using HOA community funds to pay for her personal vendetta against me. The private security guard who'd been watching my property, the additional cameras pointed at my ranch, the legal consultations about harassment options, and even the anonymous flyers warning about motorcycle dangers had all been paid for with money that belonged to the entire Desert Ridge community. Over $8,000 in HOA funds had been diverted to Clara's personal war chest, hidden in fake invoices and fictitious security expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate community needs. The evidence was all there in black and white, documented in Clara's own handwriting and signed authorizations. She'd created false service contracts with her nephew's security company, approved payments for surveillance equipment that was used exclusively to spy on my property, and even paid for legal advice on how to harass someone into leaving the neighborhood. Every transaction was a clear violation of her fiduciary duty as HOA president, and potentially criminal misuse of community funds. Clara had been so obsessed with destroying me that she'd destroyed herself instead. When Tessa emerged from the HOA office with copies of the financial records, the mood of our peaceful demonstration shifted dramatically. This was no longer just about supporting a friend who was being harassed. This was about exposing criminal activity and protecting an entire community from a corrupt leader who'd been stealing their money. Tommy called for everyone's attention, and 47 voices fell silent as Tessa explained what she'd discovered. The anger in their faces was unmistakable, but it was the controlled anger of men who knew how to channel their fury into productive action. Word spread quickly through the crowd of residents who'd gathered to watch our demonstration. Clara Whitney hadn't just been harassing the motorcycle guy. She'd been stealing from every family in Desert Ridge to fund her personal obsession. Parents who'd paid HOA fees to maintain community amenities discovered their money had been used to hire private investigators and security guards for one woman's vendetta. The community's sympathy for Clara evaporated instantly, replaced by outrage at someone who'd betrayed their trust while hiding behind concerns about safety and property values. The HOA board members started arriving within the hour, summoned by phone calls from angry residents who demanded an emergency meeting. These were ordinary people who'd volunteered to help manage their community, not career politicians who knew how to handle corruption scandals. When they saw the financial evidence that Tessa had uncovered, their faces went white with shock and anger. Board member Janet Murphy, a retired teacher who'd known Clara for less than a year, was almost speechless with rage. "She told us the security expenses were necessary to protect our children," Janet said, her voice shaking. "She was stealing from families to pay for her personal revenge." Clara's final breakdown was spectacular and public. Faced with 47 bikers, over 100 angry residents, criminal evidence of embezzlement, and the complete collapse of her authority as HOA president, she lost whatever remained of her sanity. She ran out of the office building, screaming about conspiracies and terrorist attacks, demanding that someone arrest the dangerous criminals who were obviously plotting against her. Her makeup was streaked with tears, her carefully styled hair was disheveled, and her voice was so shrill that several children started crying. It was the complete destruction of someone who'd spent months trying to destroy other people. The police response was swift and professional. Officer Grayson Ford had been watching the situation develop all afternoon, and when the financial evidence emerged, he called for backup and a detective to investigate the embezzlement charges. Clara was arrested for theft of community funds, filing false police reports, and harassment, while over 200 people watched from the street. As they put her in handcuffs, she was still screaming about motorcycle gangs and terrorist conspiracies, making it clear to everyone present that she'd lost touch with reality completely. The contrast between Clara's arrest and the behavior of 47 supposedly dangerous bikers was perfect poetic justice. While she screamed and struggled against the police officers, the desert wolves stood in respectful silence, removing their hats like they were at a funeral. When the handcuffs clicked shut, 47 engines started in perfect synchronization, creating a victory salute that echoed across the entire neighborhood. We hadn't threatened Clara, we hadn't touched her, we hadn't even spoken to her. We'd simply existed in overwhelming numbers while the truth destroyed her more completely than any revenge could have. 6 months later, Clara Whitney was living 3 states away in Nevada, still calling police departments about suspicious motorcycle activity, and still convinced that biker gangs were following her across the country. She'd been forced to sell her Desert Ridge house to pay restitution to the HOA and legal fees for her criminal defense. The new HOA president, Janet Murphy, had adopted a live and let live philosophy that made the community a much more pleasant place for everyone. My ranch had become the unofficial gathering spot for Desert Wolves barbecues and charity ride planning sessions, and my 23 Harleys were now considered neighborhood treasures rather than threats. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to match their aggression, but to let them destroy themselves while you maintain the moral high ground. Clara thought she was fighting against 23 motorcycles, but she was actually fighting against an entire community's sense of fairness and justice. When 47 Desert Wolves showed up that Saturday, they weren't threatening anyone or breaking any laws. They were just showing Clara what real community support looks like, and proving that her paranoid fantasies about dangerous bikers were nothing more than the delusions of someone who'd let personal trauma consume her judgment. Those 23 Harleys are still in my garage, and they're still loud as hell when I fire them up on Saturday mornings. The difference is that now the whole neighborhood comes out to listen, and some of the kids even ask if they can help me work on them. Clara wanted to drive me away because my motorcycles reminded her of her worst memories, but instead she ended up creating new friendships and bringing our community closer together. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting your enemies defeat themselves through their own hatred and stupidity.